Good afternoon, everybody. Please take place so that we can take up the schedule. We will begin with a talk by Kostas Kampourakis. Kostas currently works at the University of Geneva, where he teaches courses to undergraduate biology students, PhD students, and he's also very much involved in science teacher education. He's the author and editor of several books about science, with particular interest in the public understanding and teaching of evolution and genetics, as well as the nature of science. In 24, he was awarded the award for the Darwin Award for the Friends of Darwin, how it is called precisely, for his contributions to the teaching of biology in general and evolution in particular. He is also the editor of the book series Understanding Life, published by Cambridge University Press, and in the past he was editor-in-chief of the journal Science Education, as well as the founding editor of two book series focusing on science education. So broad field of experience, and Kostas, we are looking forward to your talk.
Alors, merci Andreas, merci à tout le monde d'être là, et merci à Manuel et Andreas pour l'invitation. Alors, j'avais préparé des diapositives en français, j'avais l'intention de parler en français, mais comme nous avons beaucoup de personnes qui ne sont pas francophones, I'm switching to English. Also, the AI thing doesn't work all the time very well. So, I hope you can follow the slides in French and my talk in English. We're in a multilingual environment anyway. So, this might look like an extreme claim, but I'm going to argue that most, if not all, concepts in biology are actually metaphors. And in saying this, I mean that we're not using metaphors to explain the concepts. The concepts themselves, by definition, are metaphors, and I'm going to use a very specific example to show this. So, this is an overview of the talk. And as you can imagine from the first title, I focus on perhaps the most central concept of the theory of evolution, which is natural selection. You see here a representation of some key concepts of the theory, initially as proposed by Darwin in 1859, then around between 1920 and 1940, when what is called the modern synthesis took place, and most recently, after the millennium, with more and more concepts being used to describe the phenomena that we try to understand. And a close study of how concepts come to be and how theories come to be has shown that metaphors and analogies are key. There's a great book by Nancy Nersessian that focuses on the work of James Clerk Maxwell, but anything that you will see here applies to Darwin and most scientists as well. And as she notes, even though conceptual changes takes place in communities, because the scientific communities that validate the concepts, it all begins by an individual who comes to coin or invent a concept in order to explain what they observe. And what she uses, she describes as a cognitive historical approach that tries to explain how individuals come to take the first crucial step in conceptual change by creating new concepts, concepts that do not exist before that. These she defines as systematic representations of the world, of nature, which we use to understand and then explain and make predictions about natural phenomena. What is important is that all these novel concepts arise in specific socio-cultural contexts. They don't arise in eureka moments, as we may think, but after careful consideration and thoughtful reflection, and always influenced by the specific context in which these individuals that come up with them live. And in all these cases, analogies have a key role, and this is what I'm going to illustrate with the key concept in Darwin's theory, which is natural selection. Already in the definition that he gave, which you can read here, the definition that he gave in 1859, he is explicit about this. He says that this principle by which some individuals manage to survive and reproduce better than others he has called it natural selection in order to mark its relation to the selection made at the time by breeders, the conscious selection of which animals or which plants they would cross in order to arrive at the traits that they wished to have. Actually, Darwin himself was involved in animal breeding, and after reading the pamphlets by breeders like John Sebright, and after seeing what they're able to do in just a few generations, he thought, well, this could be happening in nature as well. And this is more or less the analogy that he managed to construct. If we have a population with some variation, but we want to arrive at a certain outcome after a few generations, we can make the choice we want ourselves, and it is most likely that we will arrive there. So he says, perhaps this is happening in nature. Well, it could be. And he tried to make the analogy between artificial selection and natural selection, but there was a key issue here. Who makes the selection? Is it God? Is it nature? And after careful thought that took more than 20 years, he arrived that this was the competition within, but mostly between species. For instance, if we have a certain population in circles that you see here and the predators in rectangles in a specific environment, these could lead to a kind of selection which is unconscious, but still happens. If now we ask, what do people see, what do students see when they look to understand the term? I give you here some examples from dictionaries like Larousse. They're talking about a choice that is made by nature. In Le Robert, we can see the elimination of individuals which are less apt, less fit in this natural process. In a book about evolution for a broader public, the idea of natural selection goes together well with another idea, which is the survival of the fittest. And both are related to what is the outcome of this process, which is the adaptation. And at the site of the Natural History Museum in Paris, we see the same thing. We're talking about fittest individuals who have more probabilities to survive and reproduce. And this, again, results in adaptation. So you see overall that we have two concepts coming together. Natural selection as proposed by Darwin, along with another idea, which is the survival of the fittest. There are two common aspects. There is variation and there is differential survival, and they both lead to adaptation, which means something that happens mostly at the population level. It is the population that adapts, not the individuals. Now, we may wonder, and this is key for teaching, where does this come from? We look again at Wikipedia, where our students might look for an explanation, where they're talking about adaptation as the effect, the outcome of natural selection. And they go as far as to say that all this process makes optimal, perfect, almost perfect organs in order to assist this kind of survival. We go back to the Museum of Natural History again, and we see adaptation described as the stabilization of multiple variations which are favorable in a certain environment. And we also see something about the ability to adapt. And this is where a major confusion comes in place, and something that we see in the teaching of evolution as a major conceptual obstacle, which exists, as I will show you in a minute, right from the start. Even better, we go to the book suggested, at least to my kids at school, for use. They describe natural selection as a process oriented that restrains genetic variability, and it drives, in the course of evolution, at the better adaptation of organisms in their environment, and this result is also called adaptation. The problem with this is that what we usually see in films or documentaries are examples of perfect adaptation in terms of shape or in terms of color, usually. And we think that all the organisms that exist are perfectly adapted. Well, if you look at nature, it's exactly the opposite, but we usually tend to emphasize these examples. And some people are more enthusiastic and go even further. They write that when a population is under stress, selection forces or whatever, the adaptation is something that may or may not happen. Well, to survive, we have to adapt. And this may make us think that, well, animals decide how to do this, do it by instinct, dare to be nocturnal, how to avoid natural selection and things like that. These are actually the common intuitions that we find in people who have no background in biology. And these are reinforced by this idea. Why? I will come back to that again. I'm telling you the answer already, because of the analogy that is at the root of the concept, the analogy with artificial selection. Now, the problem is that documentary films, again, when they try to explain the concealment of this animal on the right, they use an analogy with the soldier you see on the left, who has consciously chosen the clothes and everything else he did on his face to be concealed. But this is not at all how things work. However, the concept itself makes this very intuitive. This will take us to the key problem, the intuitions. You may know this gentleman here. His name is Richard Dawkins, and he has written many books on evolution, more than I have. I still have 30 years to reach that number. I hope I will. But he thinks that evolution is easy to understand. So this is a book written by a colleague of his called Jerry Coyne, published in 2009, a very nice book full with evidence about evolution. But if you read the endorsement that Dawkins wrote, he writes, I used to say that those who do not believe in evolution are either stupid, insane, or ignorant, and I will maintain this, but also add now that they have not read this book. This makes us think that, well, evolution is simple to understand, and people do not accept it because they're religious or because they have not given the effort that they should. But actually, evolution is counterintuitive, and I will show you why. If I ask you the question, why do birds have wings? What would be your answer? Great, you're right. Now? Exactly. And now? Tricky, isn't it? If I ask you why planes have wings, what would you tell me? Yep. Now? Yep. Now? And again, the answer is the same. This brings us to a key difference, and this is why psychology matters in this issue. On the left, you see artifacts, objects designed and constructed for a purpose, to fly. On the right, you see animals which have evolved, but which were not designed for a purpose. Now, psychology tells us that perhaps because we grow up from a young age surrounded by artifacts, that is, objects designed and constructed for a purpose, we become very sensitive in the intentional construction and use of objects. And then we extrapolate this reasoning to nature. But unfortunately, as I just showed you, it doesn't work very well. There is an enormous literature that shows that intuitively, non-biologists, especially students, think that if an individual needs something to adapt, it will have it no matter what, especially if you give them time. Give them time and anything is possible. And you know, if we have had an evolution of more than 3.8 billion years so far, there was plenty of time for everything. The problem, so, is that when we ask any non-specialist to explain why this population is adapted in terms of color, having started from a population with variation, the intuitive explanation is that individuals adapted because they needed, because there was a plan, because there was a goal. Whereas the explanation that is acceptable by science is that there was differential survival as there was some external factor, a predator, for instance, that killed some individuals but not others, leading to the adaptation of the population in the sense, well, whoever made it must have some property that allows that, and therefore this is why it's there. If you think that people don't think that way, well, you can go to the United States and see what happens. The people who accept the naturalistic explanation for evolution used to be 9% in the 1980s, and they have gone up to 24% recently. All the others think that either God created humans in the present form, and this is still the majority, or that God somehow intervenes in the evolution of humans. And if you think that this happens only in the United States, I'm sorry you're wrong, because the results in Switzerland are a bit better, but not extremely good. You see that in the most recent report, overall it's about 60% of the population that accepts the idea that evolution is the best, the most coherent explanation for the origin of humans. You can see also that depending on the religiosity of people, there's an effect, and that's the topic for another presentation. But I can tell you already, it's not religion, it's the intuition about design that causes the problem, and it is just that religion goes together well with that. And all in all, this is a difficult idea to accept because the notion of choice, of intentional choice, is so intuitive that we cannot really get rid of that. And that was the problem with Darwin right from the start. So, when he was a student in Cambridge, as a young man, he became excited by the work of William Paley, who was a proponent of what they called at the time natural theology. And in simple terms, Paley was saying, he wrote a whole book about this topic called natural theology, that if you walk in a path and you come across a stone, you will never wonder what it does there or how it came to be. But if you come across a watch, you will see the design, the internal design, the construction and everything, and you have to think, well, someone must have designed that and put it there. And he continues what has been described as the argument from design and saying, well, this is the same for the telescope, but this could also be the same for the human eye. And if the eye is more complex than the telescope, then the designer of the human eye must be more competent than the designer of the telescope. And you know where this all leads. Darwin was very happy with this explanation. And he was willing to accept that the idea of design is central. And actually, it is Paley that is the source of inspiration for his focus on adaptation and what we called apparent design in organism. And if you look his personal evolution from 1836, when he returned from that famous voyage around the world, and especially 1839, when he first wrote about natural selection, until 1859, when the book was published, we have 20 years of thought and conflict internal about how things work. He begins from a view of perfect adaptation, and he goes gradually to another view of relative adaptation, relative to the environment. So his own conceptual change took 20 years, and we have less than that to work that with students. It's not easy. Now, in 1861, this is the third edition of the origin, he was already aware that people were complaining about his concept, natural selection. And he was saying that, well, people don't understand what I'm talking about, because why don't people complain about other words that people use, like, the effects of human selection? Or I would accept, he writes, that natural selection is a misnomer, but chemists talk about the affinities between elements, why there's no problem with that. And he arrives to say, well, this is a metaphorical expression. This should be clear. And I'm using this for a purpose. It should not be taken literally. And the reason that he insisted was that he thought that the analogy with artificial selection was so powerful that this is how he came up with the concept. And he couldn't change that. But in 1864, we have Herbert Spencer, who publishes a well-known book, The Principles of Biology, and where he describes the same process as he writes here, the same process with Darwin's In the Origin of Species, which he describes as a survival of the fittest, which has to do, as you can read here, with the continuing destruction of individuals who cannot make it, which in turn leaves only those who can make it survive and reproduce and pass on their traits to the next generation. So, Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the same idea with Darwin much later, but whom Darwin accepted as a co-inventor of the concept, and they presented together in 1858, tried to correct things and help his friend. And whereas he could understand what Darwin had in mind, he could not stand that other people were complaining. And so he says, look, people are saying, that's a letter on July 2, 1866, people say that you personify nature with what you're doing. We need to find another term that gets rid of this personification. Well, survival of the fittest, the term that Spencer came up with, is better. Darwin replies a few days later saying, well, I fully agree with you, and I think his expression is excellent. Unfortunately, he had just sent the new edition of The Origin to the press. It wasn't that easy at that time to publish books as it is today. And so he says, well, I thought this could work, but I now see the problem. And indeed, in the next edition, the 5th edition that came out in 1869, he adds this sentence in which he writes, well, here's the metaphor again. He describes natural selection as he liked, but he admits that Herbert's expression, the survival of the fittest, is more convenient and more accurate. And this is, as you saw initially, how many venues, have books or pages treat the two concepts. Now, the problem is that both of these are metaphors, and they are used to make clearer and easier to understand this process, but none of these works entirely well. And as you know, and that's a great book about the use of metaphors in the life sciences, in the series that Andreas mentioned, that I'm working on in Cambridge, you know, as you're here, that we use metaphors to explain something that is not easily understood with something we understand very well. And this is what Darwin and Spencer did. But if we go a little bit deeper in the analysis of metaphor, we can use a scheme that can clarify things for us. So this is based on what is called the interaction view of metaphor by a philosopher. And he talks about the two topics, we would say source and target, and then what this entails, what the metaphor entails for the concept or the topic we want to explain. There are some things that we can infer on the basis of that, but at the same time, there are things that are masked and things we miss. So if we apply this not that simple scheme to the two metaphors, natural selection and the survival of the fittest, we get quite different results. So we have in both cases the same phenomenon, differential survival in nature. If we try to make the analogy with the artificial selection made by breeders, this metaphor allows us to understand that certain characteristics can be chosen, selected, others not. These characteristics that are selected usually serve a role or a function. And based on that, we can make an inference that, well, this could be an intentional process. And as you know, in the Gallup results, many people in the United States accept that God can intervene in this natural process. It also can imply an external selector, and this doesn't have to be God, it can be nature for other people. And at the same time, what this metaphor masks is that, well, this is a blind process. The metaphor that Richard Dawkins uses for natural selection is the blind watchmaker, another metaphor with advantages and disadvantages. There are many metaphors for this phenomenon. And it also masks that what we perceive as design is not really design, it is just the outcome of this very long and complex process. If we take the scheme to the other metaphor, the survival of the fittest, and we try to explain the differential survival on the basis of a struggle for existence in nature, as Spencer did, we can see that there is a nature full of competition among living beings, which is true, and a reality which is quite brutal, which unfortunately is also true in nature. This also allows us to see that only the strongest survive, and that elimination, killing each other, is natural, which is not entirely true. There are many, many traits which many individuals and species which are not that strong but still survive. And the most important thing is that cooperation or symbiosis, which are key phenomena in the evolution of life, are not there. So, as you can see, whatever metaphor we choose, there are advantages and disadvantages. And the question is not which one is the best metaphor. The question is, do we explain to students, to non-experts, exactly what are the limits and the advantages of each metaphor, of each concept? I think that this is the key thing to do. We can have many of these. They can work in different ways. What is important is to understand their limitations and their potential, because we will always have both. Now, the most important thing is that the survival of the fittest does not describe at all Darwin's view, because the survival of the fittest, as illustrated above, is just the elimination of everyone else except for the fittest. This is selection against traits, whereas Darwin had not an eliminative view of selection, but a more creative view of selection, the one that you see below. Selection for traits, in the sense that some traits provide more or less advantages, but in the end we can have a variation. Some are much more advantageous, some are less advantageous, but it's never one. So in the end, what Darwin did to address the criticism of his own metaphor was to adopt a metaphor that did not describe his own view. And as historians explain, Darwin had in mind a process that allows for variation, that in turn allows for change and evolution and adaptation, and he did not focus that much on elimination, as Spencer did, who of course had different kinds of thinking about society, and what has been known as social Darwinism was actually Spencer's idea and should be called social Spencerism, but that's another discussion. So, to summarize, we have two metaphors which are clearly distinct. They should not be considered as synonyms, and the point for teaching, because this is what I'm mostly interested in, is that whatever we use, we need to first explain to students or student teachers that these are metaphors, and then explain their powers and their limitations so that these are clear. There's no way, in my view, that we will ever have the perfect metaphor, but we can do our best to explain this to our students and teachers. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.